All right, I think it's time to get started here. We got our crew sitting over here, so I'll talk to the left here, end of the camera. Thank you guys so much for coming. I have just really appreciated the enthusiasm, the desire. I've just been hearing so many good things about how this is affecting people, and maybe just as people are coming in and everything, we are going to keep doing courses like this. So after this one, after 2 weeks after Easter, I'm going to start another 4-week course, Tuesday nights. I'm going to call it Better Than Heaven. And we're going to look at all the different, ways to look at heaven and afterlife, and what does it actually mean, and what does it mean for us today? And so I'm really excited about that. Where is this world headed? Are we getting better and better, or is the things getting worse and worse? So that'll be, we'll be focusing on Revelation and other parts of the Bible and explaining God's offering us something better than heaven, better than what you thought. So, and then I want to do a course eventually, I don't know when I'm going to offer this, on discovering your strengths, discovering maybe career path and values and where you see yourself. And so I think that could be another pretty exciting class. So looks like we got a nice crew also online. And everybody get a handout on the way in here? All right. Well, why don't I begin with prayer, and then we'll start kind of reviewing what we've talked about, and then we'll get into our class. Lord God, thank you so much for this opportunity to discover what you have to say about some very challenging subjects like grief and loss and trauma. Pray, Lord God, that you would guide our conversation, and everything that we would learn tonight would glorify you, would be in line with your word. We ask all this in your name. Amen. This is a challenging subject that we're going to talk about this evening, grief and loss and trauma and all those things. So, if anybody needs to, take a break or walk out of the room or any of those kind of things, that's understandable. And then with all these things, what I've been so thankful for is it's opened up more dialogue. I've had quite a few people have come up to me and called me and emailed me, and I've been setting up more meetings with people. And here for pastoral counseling, this is where I want to be. I want to be your pastor through these things. So let's just kind of review the things that we've talked about so far. Our first class, we talked about understanding our story in view of God's story, how to understand what our story looks like. Then we also have talked about our spiritual battle based on our unique personality. And so we took the Enneagram test, and we talked about how we might have a certain weakness because of our strength. We might have, the things that we do really well, the strength that we have if we're a peacemaker, a helper, or all those different things, a romantic, an investigator. We bring these strengths to a certain situation. They motivate us, but sometimes if we lean too heavy on those strings, they can cause other issues. And so in each strength that we have, there's an opportunity, a dark side. There's another test too that I just took that I really like, a free assessment online called Standout. Standout, that would be one that I think I'm going to actually use in the career class and kind of class coming up. Then last time we talked about bearing the cross of our stage of life and vocation. So we kind of mapped through the different stages of life, especially as a Christian, and how you maybe come into the Christian faith and you kind of have that learner stage, and then the warrior stage, and then the stage of finally when things don't start to work anymore, that stage of brokenness. And sometimes you hit this wall, this cross, where all these things that we were so excited about in our Christian faith, they don't seem to work anymore. Many times it feels like a midlife crisis. Maybe that's what you're going through. And then so walking through those challenging things. So that's what we talked about last time. And tonight we'll be talking about walking through grief and pain and conflict and loss and trauma, all those things, the really challenging things, and how can we be emotionally healthy through them. And then for the last class, we're going to talk about resiliency. How can we get as strong and resilient as possible? How can we become the kind of people that we're not going to be able to take away all the emotionally challenging things in our life? This life will continue to be challenging, but how can we become the most resilient, the strongest people possible? Okay, so that'll be last class. All right? So let's dive into tonight's class, and happy to kind of see if there's any questions of anything online, but happy to, if you guys online can keep a discussion going. And so, all right, let's keep her moving. So here's the reality of grief and trauma. I mean, I've been a pastor for 10 years, been there at, one of the privileges of being a pastor is, people call us when they're in their hardest moments. Sometimes before the police get there and someone has passed away. I've had that happen quite a few times. I'm there first and been there with people in times of grief and loss, and walked with people through lots of different things like that. And so as I was preparing for this lesson, I called one of my friends. She's a trauma therapist and a Christian. And when her husband died of a heart attack at age 40, it's just a total tragic, out of the blue thing. I was there with her when before anyone else got there, and just really challenging, but in a way, privileged to be there in that really tough moments. I called her and I said, okay, I'm teaching this class on grief and trauma, and so what do I need to remember? What do people need to remember as they walk through grief and trauma? And so here are some of the points. She helped me with some of these, and some of these I've been reading about and thinking of from my own experience. So number one, everybody hurts. To quote REM. Anyone remember that song? I'm not going to sing, don't worry. But it's the reality that, we might say, oh, my stuff's not as bad as somebody else's stuff, but you're just not going to get through this life, this side of Eden, the other side of Eden, without loss. In fact, either you're grieving a loss or you're preparing for a loss. We're all in the middle of really overcoming one loss over another. When we moved, it's the loss of some friendships. It's when go start a new job, a loss of normal situations, and then there's the loss of loved ones, a loss of normalcy. So many losses over and over again, okay? So everybody hurts. So this is kind of a universal issue. The next one is what my friend Becky really helped me with. She said, processing grief and trauma is the most individualized experience a person can have. No two people experience it exactly alike. And so I think that is really, really important. If you're trying to help somebody through a loss and grief and trauma, you might want to speed things up, and they're not ready to speed things up yet. You might think, why am I not over this yet? And you can't get over something. So everybody, I know there was the talk about the different stages of grief, and I think people experience different stages, maybe not all of them, different times, different ways. And so there's no easy profile. There's no easy system to shoot people through trauma. There's just being there with people as they work through it. Here's something else. In these past few years, number 3, these past few years have been filled with loss for many of us. just the losses because of COVID, the loss of intimacy with people because we're wearing these, can I say, stupid masks that we have to wear all the time, right? The loss of friendship, the loss of the way things were. So many people have lost marriages through this. People have lost relationships. People have died because of COVID. I mean, it's just been a year of loss. And so everybody is hurting right now for different reasons. Number 4, I think is true. Unaddressed pain and trauma are transferred instead of transformed. So when we go through traumatic situations, when we go through really difficult things, everyone does have to process them in their own way. But if they're unaddressed, if you just stuff them your whole life, trauma and loss that's just been stuffed is transferred onto other people, onto other relationships, onto other things instead of transformed. But if you can walk with other people, if you can find trusted counselors and pastors and friends and find safe places where you can say, that was then, this is now, and you can find safe places to begin to process that, your trauma and grief can be transformed in your own time, at your own pace. But if it never happens, if that transformation never takes place or you never begin that process, somebody who never faces it at all, it's transferred. And you probably experienced that. People who have never been transformed through grief and loss, they pass it on to the next generation or pass it on to other people. Okay? Because it is so painful, and because there's so many, it's just so challenging, we might avoid, this is number 5, we might avoid grief through denial, minimization, blaming others, ourselves, rationalizing, distracting, medicating, becoming hostile. So that's what I mean. If you don't transform this grief and loss, if you don't walk through it, the only other option is medicating. Or minimizing, or denying, or blaming, or heaping guilt and shame on yourself, or beating yourself up. That's the only way out of it. It's no way out. And then when it comes to grief and pain and trauma, the body, not just the mind, keeps the score. And so that was the book I shared with you guys last week, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. That when someone goes through trauma and loss and grief and pain, it's not just a problem in the brain. And that's why I think, cognitive behavioral therapy can be very good, but just talk therapy sometimes isn't enough. When you go through trauma and loss and grief, your body reminds you, you have a visceral reaction. And so it's really important to address all of those needs and to live out with your body a new, safe, healthy life, processing through that. And that brings me to a study that was done. The reason I really kind of have gotten more and more interested and just, this is where people need the most help. And so when I got to my previous call, my previous ministry about 7 years ago, there was a man named, and maybe I've told you this story, so forgive me if I have, Victor Veith, and he is basically a world-renowned trauma and child protection advocate who was a child protection lawyer, and now he works for all different organizations. Everybody calls him in to teach and to watch over for child protection issues mostly. But he was teaching a conference, and he just happened to be, he lived right down the road from me, and I got to know him. And I just didn't even have this on my map. And then he started sharing with me some things from this study called the ACE study. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the ACE study. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And what this study found was basically this researcher was doing a weight loss study. And he was doing this weight loss study, and he found that some of the people who had lost the weight fastest also gained it back fastest. And so he started interviewing them, and they started finding out that they were, that they said, this is just my comfort. This is just how I comfort myself. And he started doing this research, and he was the one who came up and said, in the best neighborhoods, 1 out of 4 women have experienced abuse and trauma, and 1 out of 6 men. So about 33% of all population have had abuse in their life. And he put up he found out that when it comes to grief and trauma, this is the ACE study here, and he says if you've had an adverse childhood experience, because of what it does to your immune system and things like that, you have things that you're probably susceptible to that have nothing, you would think nothing to do with your experience that you went through, the grief, the loss, the trauma that you experienced. But he found as he did this research that all of these other things, sleep disturbances, hallucinations, all these things, liver disease, things that you would think cancer, that would have no correlation with your experience, you had a much higher risk. And he said that when he was counseling people, just letting them know that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. This is, if you've had an adverse childhood experience, this is the reality of these are things that are more challenging. And so it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And so this kind of, for me, woke me up that as a pastor, sometimes we look at some of these other things that people are struggling with, reckless behavior or drug dependency. And as a pastor, maybe I would have gone after that thing. And maybe, hey, you're sinning by, using drugs or abusing alcohol or everything. I started asking deeper questions. How are you doing? Is there anything I can help with? Assuming there was probably a lot more behind it than the thing itself. And meeting with Victor Veith has just over the years, and now since then I'm on different boards and different things like that to advocate for children, especially children, but for anybody who's in an abusive relationship, abusive situation, who's going through this adverse experience, because I recognize all the other health issues and spiritual issues that can happen. So that's why this is a passion for me as a pastor to encourage, to step in there and be an advocate and let people know that I want to be there for people. I want people to know it's not their fault. I want people to be able to find safe places to process these very difficult things. Okay? All right. Now, what's so interesting about the Bible is the Bible doesn't shy away from these very challenging things. In fact, there's a whole book of the Bible, one of the longest books in the Old Testament, probably maybe one of the most ancient books in the Old Testament. We don't know exactly when the book of Job was written. Many people believe it could be one of the most ancient books. Is one on trauma and grief and loss. And so we're going to just kind of walk through this a little bit. I'm going to just kind of tell the basic story, if you don't know the story of Job, and then some of the insights that we can get out of it, okay? And so Job, he's probably a real historical person, but man, the way the book is written, it's almost like a drama. Because it begins, the opening scene, Job is this super righteous man. God says so. He doesn't really do anything wrong. Even when his children sin, he makes sacrifices for them. He offers up petitions and sacrifices for his children, just in case any of them have sinned when they were all partying together. And so he's just this super righteous man. And then you have the accuser, he's called, and many people see that as Satan himself coming and saying, well, no wonder he's so righteous, God, because you make his life so easy. And so for whatever reason, God kind of allows these challenging things happen to Job, and Job never knows why. And we don't even understand why, but that's not really the point. The point is not why all this happened, just the reality that everybody goes through trauma and loss. And so all of a sudden, he loses everything. He loses his wealth. He's a very wealthy man. He loses his reputation in the community. He loses all of his children, and yet he still does not lose his faith. And so the Satan, or the accuser, says, well, unless everything is okay, but you haven't even touched him. And so he was allowed to even attack Job, and so Job lost his health. And so Job has literally lost everything, and then 3 friends show up. And again, the way it's portrayed, it's almost like this interesting drama that 3 friends kind of show up on stage with Job. And at first, they shut their mouth, and they just sit there with him. And that's really what most people need. When you're going through trauma and loss and grief, they really don't need advice. They're not ready even to hear advice. Sometimes they just need someone to sit with them. But they didn't stop there. And I think they got nervous with the silence, it seems like, and they started to try to figure out why this happened to Job as a way almost to justify themselves. Like, Job, what did you do wrong? Job, you must have unrepented sin. Job, you must have stole something and never paid someone back. God must be giving you what you deserve. And so they started accusing him and telling him that he's done all these things wrong and God's paying him back. And the whole time Job's saying, there's nothing that I did that I deserve this. We're all sinful, yes, but this isn't like, I didn't do anything that deserves what happened here. Why is this happening? And that kind of shows us that a lot of times when people accuse or condemn or want to give advice or whatever, or want to figure out why, it's not because they care about people like Job. It's because they want to justify themselves and make sure that nothing like this happens to me, right? And so Job goes through this. He cries out to God in anger. He laments. And you have like 20-some chapters of one friend coming on stage to Job and them having this discourse. And it's all in poetry, which makes it sound more like a drama, more like a musical almost. And accusing Job of something to do wrong. Job responds. Then the friend leaves. Then a new friend comes on stage. They go through a similar kind of dialogue. Then the friend leaves, goes off stage. And so you have these 3 friends, and there's, I think, 3 sessions of this, 3 scenes, 3 acts of these 3 friends coming on in succession. Finally, Job says, enough with you. I want to talk to God himself. I want to talk to God himself. And God comes in a whirlwind and speaks with Job and says, Job, where were you when I created the earth? You don't get to ask questions of me. I'm going to ask questions of you. Who takes care of the world? Who takes care of your body? Who makes all things happen the way they're supposed to be happen? Who feeds the goats on top of the mountaintops? Who teaches the fish how to swim and the birds how to fly? Who organizes all the millions of stars? He goes through he kind of takes them on this whole tour of creation saying, you can trust me. You can trust me. And so finally the book ends with Job trusting God, hearing from God, believing that and Job never gets an answer, never answers his why question. But then at the end of the story, everything that Job has lost, he regains in double portion. He gets double of everything he lost, except he doesn't get double children. I think he had 7 children, and he just gets 7 new children, almost as if he doesn't need double children because it's not like he actually lost them. He will see them again. And so it's just a really beautiful, challenging book. And so that's kind of the general overview, a quick run through the book of Job. And now I want to look at a few verses a little bit in detail and see what we can learn about grief and loss and trauma through this very challenging book, okay? So we hear Job in Job chapter 10 lamenting. He says, I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I say to God, do not declare me guilty, but tell me what charges you have against me. So Job is really mad. He's yelling at God. He says, show me what I did wrong. And he's almost beating on God's chest. This is called a lament. And so we have here on the screen, it's important to lament, paying attention to your real emotions of sadness, anger, fear, frustration, and confusion. The reality is we are uncomfortable with lamenting in our society today. We're uncomfortable with letting people just get ticked off at how things are going. We're uncomfortable with people showing these emotions of anger, of sadness, of grief. We want to move on. We don't. People make us feel uncomfortable if they're too emotional around us. But if you read the book of Psalms, like there's 150 Psalms, it's like the first, 50 plus are laments. The first 50 plus are these crying and lamenting and crying out to God, yelling at God, God, why aren't you doing something? And so but what's kind of interesting about the book of Psalms is you have all these laments, and then peppered within them you have these songs of praise. And then the last 5 to 10 Psalms are all praise. And so it's almost like that's what our life is. Our life is grieving all these losses, loss of job, loss of life, loss of children, loss of youth, loss of health. Our life is a series of losses, but as we go through that process of grieving and lamenting, our lamenting turns into praise as we walk with the Lord. And that's what this book of Psalms is like, if you just read it straight through. And so we need to give people we need to just sit there with people and let people get angry with God, get angry with the situation, lament, grieve, cry, process this. And sometimes it happens in different ways. Sometimes you think, I should be over this already, but we need to go through that process of facing it. A lot of times, I know some of the challenging things I've experienced, I was numb in the moment. Months later, all of a sudden something happened, triggers a response, and then it all comes out. And then I go through all of these experiences and all these emotions. And so giving people room to get angry. And that's what Job did. Now what's interesting is Job says, I'm ticked at you, God. What are you doing, God? Where are you? And at the end of the book, God does not accuse Job of wrongdoing, but he accuses wrongdoing of Job's friends for playing the role of God and thinking they knew exactly what was going on in Job's life and not being good counselors. But God does not accuse Job of wrongdoing when he was pounding on his chest. So if you need to pound on God's chest a little bit, if you need to yell at him a little bit, he can take it. It makes me think of the Lieutenant Dan story in Forrest Gump. Anyone seen Forrest Gump? And when he's got that scene in the storm, when he's up on the mast of the sail, right, and he's just yelling and having that moment, and that is part of the tradition of the biblical authors in the book of Job, in the book of, there's a whole book called Lamentations, a book of lament, being honest about what we're really feeling. Okay? All right, we'll keep going here. Job chapter 16, then, Job says this. I have heard many things like these. You miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? What ails you that you keep on arguing? I also could speak like you if you were in my place. I could make speeches, fine speeches against you and shake my head against you. But my mouth would encourage you. Comfort from my lips would bring you relief. Again, this is all poetry. This whole book is poetry, so it can be pretty challenging to read, but you hear what he's saying. You guys are all miserable counselors. You come on stage here and you don't listen to what I'm actually going through. You want to just tell me why I'm wrong. You want to tell me how to change my life around and fix everything right away. And you want to fix me right away. And so Job calls his friends miserable counselors. And he says, you know what? If I were in your place, I could say the same thing. I could tell you all the ways that you can pick up your bootstraps and move on. But that's not helping right now. And so here's my point that we learn from this. Many times people don't know the best way to help those who are grieving. Many times people will try to give you advice right away. They won't know how to listen right away. They won't give you space to grieve. They won't give you space to process. They want to jump in and give you advice. They want to change the subject. They get uncomfortable. And so don't be surprised that in your grieving process, people might say some stupid things. It hurts, it's hard, but it's just how it is, unfortunately. It's a lot of their own insecurity. They want to move past this because if you're really grieving, they might have to suffer too, And so it's compassion. The word passion means suffering, and compassion means to suffer with. To have real compassion with somebody is to be able to suffer with somebody, to be able to sit there with that other person in their grief. And not many people are very good at that. And that's what Job was experiencing, and maybe you've experienced that too. All right. Here's what Job says. Yet if I speak, my pain is not relieved, and if I refrain, it does not go away. Surely, God, you have worn me out. You have devastated my entire household. You have shriveled me up, and it has become a witness. My gauntness rises up and testifies against me. So he's saying, if I speak, my pain is not relieved. If I refrain, it does not go away. Sometimes nothing seems to help. And so we want a quick and easy solution to grief and to pain. And what I said at the beginning, it's very individualized. There's not a quick and easy solution to get through things. We're all going to have to find our own way to walk through grief and pain and trauma. And so I've had those moments too where I'm just yelling at God, fix it, God. Show me what I'm supposed to do. Make this better. And it just seems like there's nobody on the other side of the phone, right? But that doesn't mean he's not there. That doesn't mean he's not listening. It just doesn't mean there's just no quick and easy answer right now. Okay? And so Job says, it doesn't seem to matter whatever I do. If I speak, it doesn't go away. If I'm silent, it doesn't go away. God, what do you want me to do? You're not fixing this. And so there's very often when we walk through pain and grief and trouble and trauma and conflict, there's not a quick and easy solution. And so what's interesting about Hebrew poetry is that usually if you go to like Psalms, many of the prophets, there's this thing called centering that we usually wait, like when we think of a movie, the climax is at the end. The point of the story is at the end. In Hebrew poetry, very often, if you want to find the main idea, it's at the center of the poem. Everything kind of builds up. The center of the book of Ecclesiastes is the heart of that book. The center of most Psalms is the point. The center of the second half of Isaiah is he was pierced for our transgressions and he was crushed for our iniquities. That's the center of Isaiah 2. And now the center of the book of Job is Job 19. Where we get that line from the famous Easter hymn, I know my Redeemer lives. And so this is what he says. Oh, that my words were recorded, They were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him. With my own eyes, I and not another, how my heart yearns within me. So our ultimate hope is not a quick solution, it's in the resurrection. Job, probably thousands of years before Jesus' resurrection, knew that there was going to be a final resurrection of all things. The Bible, there was always this ancient Jewish hope that the world that God created was going to be resurrected, and Jesus showed that by his resurrection from the dead. So, whatever healing that we receive as you and I walk with each other through processing grief upon grief, we're always processing some kind of grief at all times in our life. Whatever we move through, it's only going to be partial healing at best. But the good news is when God comes back, when Jesus comes back, he's not just going to destroy this world. He's going to resurrect this world. And that's really what my whole next class is going to be on, Better Than Heaven, about the resurrection, what that means for our life right now. But Job's ultimate hope is a complete restoration. So your body without any of the wounds, any of the scars from the trauma, your brain without any of the pain and the loss, the reuniting with loved ones, but in a perfect world where there'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, that the world is going to be resurrected along with our bodies, our animals, all these things resurrected. That's how the Bible portrays the last page of the Bible. So there's not a quick and easy solution, but there's an ultimate happy ending in the life to come, the world to come, the resurrection. That's what Job saw. That's the center of this book. And so that shows us that's the main hope that we have is resurrection. That get on that path of healing, get on that path of processing, move through this guilt and shame or this trauma and grief and loss, and know that whatever you don't heal from now will be healed when God returns and resurrects all things. Okay? All right. Do I still got your attention? Anyone falling asleep yet? All right. I feel like it's easier for me to fall asleep with a mask on when people are talking. I feel like you're just kind of hiding. It's kind of like this pillow on your face, and you just kind of want to roll into it a little bit. So we'll finish up here very soon. Hope everybody is doing okay online here. Keep talking. Looks like we got a really good, healthy conversation going on here. All right. Job 38 now. So now Job finally, he says, get away from me, you miserable comforters. You guys are awful, not helpful physicians. You're worthless. I just want to talk to God. And this whirlwind starts. And all of a sudden, God comes to Job in a whirlwind, and he says this. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who struck a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. And so now the Lord's going to take Job through this, again, tour of creation and say, there's so much you don't know about creation, and there's so many things you don't understand about your life, but you can trust me. I love learning about creation because it continues to show me that God is so much bigger and beyond my understanding. So we were over at Steve Abramowski's a member of our congregation here, and we were over at his house over the weekend, and he's a nurse practitioner, so I always pick his brain about the human body and how everything works. And we were talking about blood clots. This is what I like learning about. And he was talking about when you get a little cut on your finger, there's this whole series of processes, this 8 to 16 step process that happens, cascades. It's like a cascading process to form a blood clot so that you don't bleed out when you get a cut on your finger. And then your body automatically knows, as it's starting this whole cascading process of creating a blood clot, to create a whole nother process to destroy the blood clot so that you don't clot all over your body and everything doesn't close up on your body. It's just there's so many, and that's just to figure out what to do if you get a cut on your finger so you don't either bleed out or have blood clots that stop your heart from bleeding. So that's just one tiny little thing. There's so much that we don't know. I remember hearing this, that, pop quiz. What are there more of? Are there more stars in the sky, or are there more sand on all the seashores? If you added up all the sand on all the seashores in the world, what are there more of? More stars or more sand? There's more stars. So you try to fathom that. And so there are so many things that we don't know how they all weave together. And so that's, again, as we look out at creation, that's kind of what God does. But instead of just looking out at creation, let's look to the cross. Because that's where pain and suffering and loss and death meet. That God lost his son, that Jesus was abused, that Jesus hung up on a cross, that Jesus died, that he was whipped, that we have a God who suffers, not just a God who stays in heaven and asks us questions and says, and not just a God who shows us creation, but we have a God who knows what it feels like to be in pain, to suffer loss. And that's what's so remarkable about the true God of the Bible, the real God, is he doesn't just stay perched up in heaven looking down. He gets into the mess and has felt all these things with us. All right? So the main point here is God doesn't always tell us why, because I don't think we would. He's just called us to trust. He doesn't want to replace our faith with an answer. He wants us to just have faith even without the answer. So he doesn't always give us an answer. He tells us that we can trust him. He doesn't replace faith with an answer. He just wants faith to stand there, even though we don't always understand it. I have lots of questions. I have lots of them that I want answered right now, and he has not answered me yet. And I cannot figure out why some of these things happened. And it still challenges me and makes me struggle and still makes me angry, but he's asked me to trust him even more than giving me an answer. Okay, and so this is how the book ends. After God takes Job on this whirlwind tour of creation, it says, "Then Job replied to the Lord, 'I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know.'" So, finally, Job says, some of these things are just beyond the limits of we're just too limited. And he says, I spoke of things I thought I could put, just like the three friends thought they could put God in this safe little box and make God turn him into this kind of machine that someone does wrong and God punishes, kind of like make it as easy as karma, good and bad, and you get what you deserve kind of thing, and reduce God to these kind of simple, packages of God, packaging them up and making them fit in our small little context. Job was trying to do that too, and finally he says, I see you now, that you are beyond my limited experience and too wonderful for me. And so he says here, you said, listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you shall answer me. And then Job says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. There is something about going through grief and loss and suffering and finding God on the other side of that, where Job can say, I've heard about God, but now through this experience, I have seen him. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be around superficial Christians. I just don't. I don't want to be around nominal Christians. I don't want to be around, I'll be around anybody, that's fine, but I want to be around the people who actually want to get into God's word and figure out who God is and walk with him. And I found that the only people who actually want to get into God's word and find out who he really is and walk with him are people who've suffered. And so I don't know why that is or how that all happens. Maybe we just understand our limits more and we see how much we need God to walk through that. But I don't know. I just don't have time for superficial Christianity and nominal Christianity and just this kind of surface Christianity. And so that's why I love spending time with people like you who want to talk about emotionally healthy Christianity. People who say, I want to get into this. I want to figure out what I'm supposed to respond. I want to figure out who God is, and I want to walk with God. And so that's how Job experienced. He said, I've heard about God, but now that I've walked through this, I've seen him. And people who've walked through challenging things know God at a level that other people don't. Okay? All right. How are we doing? All right. So I see some questions on here about the book of Job and is it a parable or history? I'm not saying I think who brings up Job in the New Testament? Is it James? I should know this. Job was, according to the New Testament, people talk about Job, I think even Daniel does too, talking about the faith of Job. So I do believe he's a real person. I'm just saying the way the book is written, it's written like a drama. It's written like Shakespeare. So that was, hopefully that helps out and answers the question. I believe Job was a real person. The way the book is written, it's written like a drama. It's written like a play. It's written in poetry, like a Shakespearean play, and how each friend kind of comes in an order. It's not written like a history, like books like Samuel and Kings, and it's written in a very poetic dramatization almost. But not saying that doesn't mean that things didn't actually happen to Job and he wasn't a real person. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying enjoying the literature and the way that it's laid out. So, any other questions in the room about the book of Job and anything I've talked about up to this point? I'm seeing some chatting on here. Any questions about the book of Job? All right. Okay. So I was a little hesitant to even put this up here because, as I said, healing is an individual experience. But so that's why I put, you see that possible steps to healing. These might work for you. These might be part of the process. It might just be different time and things like that. Number one, though, pay attention to what you're actually feeling. I feel like that's when people don't, again, pay attention, it's unprocessed trauma and grief and loss, and then they just get transferred onto other people. So I'd encourage you to pay attention to what you're feeling. When you go through trauma, part of trauma, it's like I remember, I still have this scar. When I was a little kid, I was working a concession stand at a T-ball or a Little League baseball game, and they had this sharp fridge, and my brother and I were racing to see who could get the soda out fastest for the customer. And so I ran faster than him, kind of pushed him out of the way, stuffed my finger into the refrigerator and pulled it out really fast, and like half my finger kind of went off. And I did not feel it, because if I would have felt it in the moment, I wouldn't have been able to handle the pain, right? And so I think part of God's design is that when you go through a traumatic situation, you can't feel all the things that are going on in that moment, physical, emotional, spiritual. But then there has to be a time later on where you got to stitch up that finger. There has to be a time later on where you have to then begin to stitch things up and process them. I notice many times when you go through a traumatic experience, you kind of stay at that place, that maybe even that age, in that moment. It's hard to move forward until you kind of go to a counselor, go to a pastor, go to friends. The body keeps the score. I've heard people having as much results when it comes to healing through trauma, being a part of an exercise group, going to Pilates, doing horse therapy, taking care of an animal, doing physical things with their body to be in safe places again, to experience healing in body and that kind of stuff. So that's something else. But so pay attention, because the pain will come back and hit you, and you got to pay attention when it comes back. Number two, experience a more accurate understanding of life, loss, and suffering of Jesus. Be more open to Jesus. Let yourself see Jesus who he is. Maybe you had this kind of caricature of Jesus, that Jesus was just kind of this like hippie guru teacher, right? Experience a more real view of Jesus, of who suffered, who got angry, who got frustrated, who got sad, who got tired, who grieved, all the emotions that Jesus went through. So be more in tune with the experience of Jesus. Find renewed hope in the resurrection of Jesus. Explore this whole idea of the resurrection and what that means, that your life is not over because you went through this. Yeah, maybe things are not going to be totally patched up as it is right now, but there is a resurrection coming, and to really explore what that means. Surround yourself with patient and safe friends or counselors or pastors who will give you space and time to heal. Find better friends than Job found, who are not just going to give you advice, who are just going to be there with you and help you, give you a safe place to heal. And then let God bring new life out of the old. Let yourself take those risks in the future in your own time. And in his time, again, not pushing it, not rushing it. Maybe it takes years, maybe it takes decades, but let yourself start over. Let yourself start a new chapter. Let yourself start a new chapter. Okay, let there be resurrection. Okay. That's as far as I wanted to get tonight, and then I wanted some discussion. So here are the discussion questions. We have maybe some little different groups here tonight. I don't know, maybe we could still go to our groups that we've met in the past. Maybe this group, now we have a little smaller numbers, maybe you guys want to go in one group there. But that's as far as I wanted to go tonight. Here are our discussion questions that you see up on the screen. I will copy them for those of you, if you want to put that button up there, Matt, for the Zoom meeting. And so why don't you guys now, we're going to go through these questions. If you feel comfortable, nobody has to, briefly share one loss you have that you've experienced that continues to affect you today. Why is it so important to see emotions like anger, grief, and sadness in the lives of Job and Jesus? Why is it so important to see characters in the Bible like Job and then the perfect one, Jesus, go through grief and loss and anger and sadness? Why is it important to remember that everyone's experience is unique? Why is that so important? And what do you need for yourself right now? And what do you need from others right now? So be willing to share as much as you're able, as much as you want, okay? So why don't you guys break up into your groups here in the room, and then I'll hopefully come around. So this ends our session here. Go ahead, break in your groups, and I will get everybody into the waiting room online in our Zoom group.